I'm Mark. Most of you probably know me already. This is Debbie Rosen.
Hello.
And one of the things that we're going to do here is show you the process that we went through to take Global 360, which was a $90 million company, in a year and a half by using the methodology here. We were able to place it, OpenText bought it for $260 million. And so what we want to do is show you the process that we went through to get global visibility and exposure for Global 360 from nothing. We had virtually no visibility in the SharePoint community at all. And then a year and a half later, OpenText bought it out. So that's what we're going to go through here. Mark, if you're tweeting or anything at EUSP, I got a couple things up here. For those that didn't know me, this is Nothing But SharePoint, so that Jeremy and I are still running Nothing But SharePoint, which is the largest SharePoint community in the world. We usually have about 140,000 users a month. I know most of you are some of those users, even authors, right? Dave, you wrote for me, right?
I've done one.
All right. The Nothing But SharePoint thing has really allowed me to travel quite a bit. This is just a couple of the places that have been around the world. And what I do when I travel around the world is I try to help build communities in those areas. The one that I liked the most from the last trip when we were in Africa, we were actually in Nairobi and we had 150 people show up in a room like this from a community that did not exist at all, just by virtue of saying we were going to be there. Joel Olson, Michael Noel, Paul Swider, Eric Harlan, John Anderson. We travel as a group called Sharing the Point. And what we do is try to build community in areas. To say it's an under-supported SharePoint community, let's go in and help them out. So that's the purpose of that. And I use the methodology here that we used with Global 360 to build the community too. You're going to see that process and what we do here. Okay? And that's Debbie.
I'm Debbie Rosen. I've been really on the software side, the technology side, for longer than I'm willing to admit to you all. Well over 25 years in senior sales executive, marketing, business development, GM, lots of software to lots of companies. And really I just wanted to share what I have done at Global 360 with Mark and then what I'm doing now at Sonatype. I'm assuming most of all of you are familiar with open source. Are you familiar with the Central Repository or Maven or Nexus? Nexus, basically, if you think about open source as components or Lego building blocks, 95% of all of those are housed in something called, for Java, are housed in something called the Central Repository, and Sonatype is the stewards of the Central Repository. We also have a huge footprint in the ecosystem, the application development ecosystem. So our Nexus repository, which is the cached repository behind the firewall, sits in about 20,000 companies, the open source. And then we have, our founder created something called Maven. If you know Maven, if you use it, a build tool, basically creating the recipes for those components. You don't have to do that by hand. But what we've done at Sonatype is trying to take a lot of those assets and build a community around that, very similar to what we did at Global 360. So we'll share kind of two different examples. So if one may not resonate with you, hopefully the other one will. But they all really follow the same recipe.
Right. So what we want to go through is to give you, these are two back-to-back sessions. The first session is going to be the process and the methodology. It's a 5-step process that as you're trying to build community, as you're trying to build visibility, as you're trying to get that global presence, what does it take to do that? That's what the first hour is. The second hour is I actually give you a framework called the community engagement process that shows you how you can gauge your project, your process when you use this methodology. So that's what about, there's no code here, there's not going to be, there's basically not anything specific to SharePoint. But what we thought here at this conference is people would be interested in what does it take to get your SharePoint product or service the visibility that you're looking for. Okay? You can use what we're about to do The five-step process, you can use it for internal communities. If you have a large corporation like a Credit Suisse or an HSBC or something like that, you can use the process internally too to drive this kind of visibility. And then we'll talk about the community engagement project. Okay. So our purpose in general, Debbie and I were talking about this last night at dinner, and it's like, what is really the purpose of building community, of building these relationships, of getting everything in place to happen? It basically comes down to this. And we're in a business, and what we want to do is we have to sell product in order to exist. We have to sell something in order to exist. And what we're trying to do is trust-based selling. By becoming part of the community, by becoming visible and a trusted relationship with the people in the community, then they will be comfortable when we offer something and say, okay, we've got something new to show you, would you like to see it? Debbie, anything on that?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. So, I'm a small group here. Why are you here? I mean, what did you expect from the presentation? What are you trying to do with community? Dave,
Well, I'm looking to build an internal community, like you said, in our company. I'm also looking to gain the knowledge to be able to spread the word about another project that I'm working on
Good.
Externally,
okay.
which is a SharePoint product that's going to hit market soon, and kind of want to get a head start on how I can raise the awareness of that one.
Nice.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I want to use it to help my customers to build community inside
Oh, good.
their organizations.
All right, good.
Yeah.
So help customers, good.
To be fair, I saw you were talking, I wanted to come and see what you say. 'Cause you were asking, or you always have something interesting to say.
That's fair enough. Is this going to be okay for you?
Yeah, in fact, I can use this outside of SharePoint as well.
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You can use this with your kids. Trust me, I wait till you see some of my slides. This is pretty,
Even if
basic.
there are 25 something, then you don't need it anymore.
yeah, no, I have a 5-year-old too, which is why I look so tired.
We have an internal community as well. SharePoint, it's my colleague and I that are solely responsible for SharePoint
Oh.
for our entire site.
How many people?
About 2,500.
Oh, okay,
And they
good.
are absolutely wed to file shares and emails and
Yeah.
desktop copies. And we're trying to evangelize. I don't like that word.
No, that's a perfect word.
We
I
like
mean, people
advocate
follow
better.
people with passion, right? So if you have that passion, then, you know, evangelizing, selling isn't a bad thing, right? We all sell all the time. It's not something, I've always said it's not what you try to do to get someone to believe something they don't believe, because that won't happen. It won't last very long. And that's not trust-based.
We've had to move our public-facing web presence into SharePoint, forcing it at them.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's given them already a bit of a bad reputation, the I hate SharePoint thing. So we need to reverse it.
Well, that's what we needed, the I heart SharePoint.
We have
That was-
stickers that say, I heart SharePoint. You can
That was
pass
the
those.
that was the slide we didn't put in there, remember?
All right.
But we'll share that with you.
Two things really. One, Steve Smith's given me kind of a roving brief to just to find out what people are saying,
Okay.
which is a good thing. And secondly, obviously as a training company, we go into organisations and sometimes there's a huge amount of resistance.
Sure.
We go into some local authorities who really just don't want SharePoint. They're used to a silo mentality. So what we're looking to do is to try to advise our customers. It's not a kind of a main area for us, obviously, but it's something which is, as trainers, if the community is built, that helps us, that makes us look better.
Sure.
If people will go away from their training and still say, I can't see that, I want to keep my information to myself, I don't see why I should share this, then obviously that reflects fully
Right.
this. And the other thing is I might get dragged away in a little while, so if I have to sneak out. Please.
Okay. Mark is your host, by the way. This is combined knowledge. So.
I'm not bailing out.
That's okay.
I might need to be needed somewhere else.
So at this part of it, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie because we've got a story we want to tell here. And a lot of what you're going to hear today is based upon stories. My official title is Senior Storyteller, so you're going to get some stories out of me. But the idea that we want to get across, just underline this whole concept, is if we can find a story to your message and actually get it so that that story resonates with people, That's going to be the foundation that you can build from. And we'll give examples so that you can kind of get an idea on it. Debbie, you want to drive?
Sure. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about Global 360, which has now been acquired by OpenText. Global 360 was a business process management company. You're familiar with that? So it's think of it as enhanced workflow, just to give you a sense of what that's all about. But it's really, at the end of the day, about making what is manual processes much more efficient, automated and efficient. But when I came on the scene, I'd come from another related company, a company called Web Methods that got acquired by Software AG. Global 360 was really nowhere. We had been a company that the CEO acquired a lot of legacy technologies, in fact, 3 competing BPM products, some on the Java platform, some on the .NET platform. And my role initially was to understand, how do we help this company grow? And one of the things that became very important looking back was this critical decision that we were actually going to find what I call the white space. Where in this broader ecosystem is there a need to be served that isn't served today? And in the broader sense, it was really around the Microsoft community, but more specifically, it became around SharePoint, because SharePoint was very much viewed as a file server, nothing more than a place to dump your files. This was probably now 6 or 7 years ago still. And even Microsoft was very, very concerned that a lot of licenses were being sold, but not being used in any way strategically by the business. So if we could become the face to SharePoint, where people went to process invoices and actually visually interacted with their work, then we could add a lot of value to the SharePoint community. But we had this huge challenge because nobody at Microsoft knew who we were. Nobody in SharePoint
Right,
knew
well,
who we
that's
were.
the next slide, too. Yeah, there.
So that's the next slide. So we had to decide, what do we do about that? And we'll talk about how we made this decision, how we got here. But the punchline really is that, and we'll talk a bit more about this, that within a year and a half or 2 years, as Mark had mentioned, we had won 2 Partner of the Year awards. And it was because of the fact that we worked very strategically to build a community of people who really saw value, not because we were selling something to them, but because we found something to allow the community to come together around something they all cared about. And that's, sorry, I'm always a slide ahead of myself. And that's Derek Weeks on the big stage. He worked for us. He still actually works at OpenText, accepting the Partner of the Year award.
That was an exciting event. That was in front of 17,000 people. It was the big Partner of the Year award, and we won 2 that year, which is pretty phenomenal.
One for SharePoint, and then one for a Visio partner. We actually created part of our solution for business analysts to leverage Visio.
Right. And the reason for bringing all that up is it was through the processes, the 5-step process that we're going to show you, that we got that visibility. We just wanted to show you a little bit of a taste of what we did, what the outcome was. I thought that in the time frame that we did it, it was a pretty phenomenal campaign. So let's see what we got.
And so what we also want to do is add a little bit of color as we go through, throughout this presentation, talking about how are we trying to do this very similar types of things at Sonatype. Sonatype is a little easier because we have a community of open source users, as I said, 20,000. There's really almost 9 billion components downloaded from this central repository every year, which just demonstrates the growing trend to assembling applications out of piece parts versus writing all that source code, right? Where I first started, I was writing a bunch of source code and about 100% of your application was handwritten. Now it's really about assembling pieces together from open source components, and each component may have multiple, dependencies and transitive dependencies. So it's a very complex ecosystem, but it's really how do you bring people together around a common platform so that you get them to understand the message that you're trying to deliver.
Okay. All right, so we're going to briefly, literally within a matter of seconds, look at the 5 steps so that you can get the process in your mind, and then we'll break down each of those 5 steps. The first one we have is we have to find out what your story is. At Global 360, we created a story around an invoice, and we gave that invoice a name. We'll go through that story when we get there. From there, we needed to find out who was influencing the market, who was actually influencing people that were making the buying decisions. So we'll show you the process on how we figured out the top 50 of those. Then from there, we had to find out, okay, who's the big dog in the space? Who do we have to align with in order not just to have our message spread globally, but actually to be the recommendation engine for us globally. So we'll look and see how that happened. And then we have to drive activity around the story. This is how do you integrate sales and marketing together, which is, Debbie's got some theories on that that I think are fascinating that I hope we can get into that. And then the fifth one is we need to make everybody in the company a marketer. And that's a weird one because I had never thought about it till Debbie and I started working together. But you've got so many chances of things that are going out, whether it's invoices, whether it's email, signatures, all kinds of stuff that can be used as implicit marketing, but it doesn't look like it's marketing. It's kind of cool the way it works. So we turned everybody in the company into the market and into a marketer. So let's dive a little deeper and see what we get. We're going to create a story here. I want to give you a little backstory here so you can see where I'm going with this. I was a concert promoter back in the 80s. I had a 1,000-seat theater, and I was a promoter at a 10,000-seat amphitheater in California. And for the 1,000-seat theater, I had to figure out how am I differentiating from everybody else in the San Francisco Bay Area that's producing concerts. And I found out that my backstory was nostalgia. If I could bring the big bands in, if I could bring the 50s bands in, I mean the original guys. So I actually became like one of the major promoters in the Bay Area for that kind of music. And the whole campaigns were built around nostalgia. We're bringing something back. Okay? So if we can find out what the underlying story is, then we can start building a message around that story.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So actually, that's what this section is about. But I want to add one other thing. So you mentioned evangelizing. You know, the one thing I would say about the story and the platform is there's a lot of technology companies, especially people who sell a product, any kind of product, right? Every company sells some product, right? Especially technology products. They tend to look at everything through this technology lens. But I don't care how technical you are, people still make buying decisions that are emotional, right? You don't buy Apple necessarily just because it's the best technology. It says something about you. There's a great video on TED.com, if you're familiar with TED, that it Start With Why. It's pretty infamous. Simon Sinek said, why do people go to these rallies, whatever rallies they go to? Even Martin Luther King didn't have the internet to bring millions of people to his rally. Why did they go? Well, it's something about themselves that they want, right? It's some emotional attachment, something they believe in that they want to say, hey, I'm out here talking about myself. That's why you never get people to do things they don't really want to do, or at least for very long. And so when you think about your story, it's really got to be some kind of an emotional platform, and that's really what Mark's talking about. Nostalgia is an emotional platform. I want to go see those bands. It's something about myself that I like, that I want to be part of. And even in this new technology you may be talking about with the SharePoint technology, I still would say, really think about, what is it about that technology that's not just the technology for technology's sake, but that can help other people do their job better, that can achieve something. So we'll talk about Global 360. Yeah, it was BPM software. It was about automated workflow. How excited is that? But you'll see throughout this story, throughout this presentation, it's really about letting people go home on time, right? Who doesn't want to get home on time? Who wants to sit there every day and transfer stuff off a piece of paper onto a screen? That's really what we're avoiding. So it's about building productivity, making your job more fun, allowing you to enjoy what you're doing. It's not just the technology. And it's the same thing that we talked about with Sonatype. And so what I've always said is that in every great company, there's a great story. And you have to find a great story, because otherwise all the rest of this really won't work. And it doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be emotional. It can't just be technology. And so the question really is, what is your story? And is it really about a specific market? So in the example with Sonatype, is it really about having a better way to secure open source based applications, which is really where we're heading? Or is it really about this idea that in every organization today, open source is so prevalent because it helps people go faster, right? But the problem is that application security, as it's out in the market today, can't keep up with the pace of development. So you have agile development methodologies, you have things like DevOps, developers going faster and faster. Who's a developer that wants to go slower, right? And who is a developer that wants to get their application back after they've created it because they found all these security vulnerabilities and they have to go fix it? No one wants to do that, right? No one wants to finish a project and get it back and say, guess what, you have to open the patient back up. So the idea for us is this platform of speed versus security. How can you finally bring those two things together? And that's really what we're trying to say, is you have to identify a platform or a choice that people can attach to. I choose to want to have more productivity. I choose to want to go fast and be secure in my organization, not have to make a trade-off of my business needs versus my security risk. And that's really what we've done, and looked at something that's emotional, that carry people with you, and something that's more of a rallying cry. And it doesn't have to be huge, right? It's not about, freedom in the world or curing cancer, but it has to be more a choice that, helps people change the way they're thinking about something, or unites people around a certain topic. And that's really been our mission. And so to change the equation for everyone, for example, you were talking about in your organization, SharePoint is thought of as a file server. So in order to change the equation for everyone, what can they accomplish with this new, better version in your mind that you have of SharePoint that they couldn't before? And how can you get everybody involved in that? Can they contribute in some way their assets to make this thing a better place? Can you give them motivations and badges and ways to get involved that can get them excited? And it's really about making sure everybody has a voice. Everyone has a way to participate in that story. And as I said, it really just can't be about the technology. So, our rules for the community, which is also rules for your children, as we said, is it's very much just like if you went off to a new neighborhood and you wanted to build a community there. You wouldn't go to your neighbor's door and, just start talking about, what they can do for you, right? You would find a way to do all of these things amongst the people that you want to create a community around. And that's why I said it's just as good for your children. I've shared this with my organization and said this is how we want to be as a company, right? We want to, add value and act with integrity. And the other thing that you hear a lot about when you're talking about building community is you can't ask things of people too quickly. So have you ever gone to a website and they want your name, information, date of birth, everything, and you're like, excuse me, but screw that. I'm not going to give them all that information because they're asking too soon. They haven't added enough value and built enough trust and relationship with you to ask for that. But if they keep at it, you download something and then you go back, and the third time and the fourth time, then they'll ask, and maybe, oh, you know what? I'll give them my name because I want to keep getting this asset. There's definitely things you sign up for, right? And you sign up for them because somehow you feel like getting that email is worth whatever the pain it is to get that. And so that's really part of the rules of the road. And Mark has taught me a lot of that. When, being a classic sales and marketer, I'm always, I can't give that white paper away because I need to get their names. But people really don't want that, especially now. They want to be able to do a lot of investigation on their own. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, that whole set there is based around the idea that we need to stop talking about SharePoint. I know that sounds odd at a SharePoint conference. But what we need to do if we really want to get engagement, if we want that emotional attachment, we have to talk about the solution that SharePoint is providing, not about SharePoint itself. And so if we can find the story, that's what we're talking about, as you're going into your new project. Let's not talk about the technology. Your user doesn't care, by the way. Your user doesn't care about SharePoint. And they shouldn't. They shouldn't have to. Okay? So in your notes, if you're taking notes, the first thing we'd like you to do is clarify for yourself, what's the storyline? How are we going to get people emotionally attached to what you're trying to do? Okay? Great. Now find your marketing influencers. Now this will be an interesting story from Debbie's perspective because I don't know, everybody have a partner or is married? Because the way that you describe how you first met is completely different depending on which partner you're talking to. And this is what Debbie and my story is about how we met up here. But one of the things that is, I think I'd like you to keep in mind, we're going to talk about influencers and how to find them. But one of the key points that Debbie said two slides ago was you can't immediately introduce yourself and then ask for something. We're seeing that a lot. I see it so many times where I'll be traveling around the world and somebody will come up and say, Mark, so glad to meet you. Can you do something for me? I mean, that's the second sentence. There isn't any relationship built yet. We need to get some kind of relationship before we can ask somebody for something. So, Debbie, let's define what an influencer is first before we get into that. Can you help with that?
So, in every community project, just put it that way, in every market, if you think about the market for your product, the market for helping your organization more effectively take advantage of SharePoint, there are influencers. You're always trying to find those people that will attach to our efforts, that will help us carry things forward. And in the technology market, it used to be that if you talk to analysts, like Gartner or Forrester, you're familiar with those, or you talk to the press, those would be your influencers because those analysts would write about you. They put you in their what they call magic quadrant. They would put you in their press articles, and that was enough. And that was 10 years ago. Well, now there's bloggers and other vendors and people who go out, like Mark Miller, right, who's not an industry analyst or a PR professional, if you will.
Well known for not being an industry analyst. Yeah.
But they're the people that influence those you're trying to reach. And as an example, if you're a technology company, you're trying to sell a product or you're trying to sell your product, you want people to start using them. And so what's happening is that, you and all the competitive voices, the people who don't like SharePoint or the people who might use another product or the people who might use another company for training or whoever that is, they're trying very hard to get into your target. But what's happening is that your targets, they don't want to talk to vendors. They may not want to talk to people who are rallying around SharePoint, but they do want to talk to different types of people who might influence them. And this is an example in the technology space from a company called Influencer 50 that says, look, if your executives at your company want to buy a particular type of product, they're going to talk to systems integrators, like Accenture or those types of guys or folks. They're going to go to user groups. They're going to meet Mark, speakers and events, their peers. So if they're a chief information officer or a chief security officer, they're going to talk to people and their peers. So if we can influence this green circle, then, and to positively, view our message, then that's the most effective way to get to these guys.
Great.
So the idea is, who are the top influencers in a particular market? And to put a specific point to it, when we were at Global 360, we didn't know anybody in the SharePoint market. We have no idea. So we had to go out and figure out who are the most influential voices. If I asked you right now, who are the most influential voices in SharePoint, would you have any idea? Who are the people you see at conference? You said you came to see Mark. That's an example, right? Why did you come to see Mark? Because he's supposedly an influential voice, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You made an emotional decision, maybe I'm going to learn something from a guy who has this reputation that I can learn something from him. So this was an example of a report that we happen to do in the BPM space by a company called Influencer 50, and there's a lot of ways to get this information. It's not just, you don't have to go out necessarily and buy it, but it's really important to think about, in your case, who could be the most influential to drive people to use SharePoint in a different way than they're thinking about it? And how do you bring that circle of influencers together? And as I said, this is 50 in the BPM space. She happens to be the lead BPM analyst at Gartner. But then we went and did this exact same project for SharePoint and got the top 50 influencers in the SharePoint space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I met Mark.
So I kept getting this phone call, and my assistant would put a phone call, Debbie Rosen's calling. I said, who in the hell's Debbie Rosen? I don't know Debbie Rosen. So she called, I don't know, about a month, almost once a week for a month. And finally I picked up the phone and said, what do you want? What's, And so she went through this, and I said, okay. So I got what she was trying to do. And it made sense.
You said you were a top influencer.
Yeah, she said, you're a top influencer in the world. Yeah, okay. So I don't pay attention to that stuff. It's not why I do what I do. And then she started talking about, well, we need an influencer on our team. Could you recommend somebody? And I said, sure. So I gave you a couple names, and she, and I introduced her to a couple people, and nobody really bit because they were busy. They were either working with Microsoft or had their own companies or something like that. And then one of those guys said, well, how come they're not asking you to do it? And I said, I don't know. So I called up Debbie and said, how come you haven't asked me? And said, then the story goes to you.
That's, well, I didn't think you'd do it. But what I really was looking for was, look, I don't want to get Mark. I knew I couldn't get Mark to believe in, our story unless it was a good story. But I didn't know anything about SharePoint, and I didn't know people in the SharePoint community, how they wanted to hear about things in a way that they would, get value from. I knew how to sell BPM, but I didn't know how to sell BPM with SharePoint, right, and what value that would add to the SharePoint market. And so when I was asking that of Mark, it was, hey, can you help me around something you love to do? And then we had that shared passion, and that's what I was talking about, the story and the platform. I mean, how do you find something that you share?
I had to believe in her story before I would, I finally picked up the phone, but she had to get to the story first. She didn't have, I don't care about the technology. I know all the BPM players. I know them personally. I don't need to hear about BPM. I need to hear what your story is. And when we're going to the community effort internally, if we can refine the story internally for your internal communities, that's when you're going to start getting your buy-in. And the way I've seen this happen, and I've helped people do it before, the stories can revolve around solutions that people in the company have developed, something really simple. One of the simplest things I ever did is I created a little web part that had a weather magnet in it. I just went to weather.com, cut and pasted their embed code into a content editor web part. I had over 10,000 downloads of that. But those types of solutions where you can actually show people, these are the simple things that we've done in-house to make life easier. It had nothing to do with SharePoint. What happened is I was talking with Lori Garcia, who is like the SharePoint administrator for the Chesapeake Power and Gas Company in Oklahoma or something. And she had given a session on what are the 5 things that you got people to use your SharePoint site in-house. And one is, she said, well, we're in Oklahoma and the weather changes every 5 minutes. So I put a weather magnet up on the SharePoint site, and everybody started going there to see the weather. They didn't care that it was SharePoint. Find your story. Find what's going to engage people in the story. So then what we did is, Debbie looked at that with our team, and we said, okay, we can't just roll this thing out. There's a bigger discussion than that, because when Debbie first called me, I don't think there was any intention of rolling the Influencer 50 study out at all. What was done is they were doing it for internal use. Who do we need to influence? I said, you've got a gold mine sitting here. you can actually you're going to create a thunderstorm once you put it out there. It was a little more graphic than that. You're going to create a storm when you put this out to the community because everybody's going to be arguing about it. I said, that's a good thing. So what we did is we broke it down to segments of influencers. There was the journalists, there are, who else did you have?
Analysts.
Yeah, analysts, things like that. So if your influencers are big, then you're going to have to segment it so people can consume it easier. You can't just throw a ton of information out there. But we found the influencers, found out the different ways that they could, and then we went through this process. We started building a campaign specifically towards those influencers. Debbie?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key really is, so who can help you spread your story the most, and then how do you get them engaged in the story in a way that they're excited about it? And it really, some of this is more around what we did. A lot of times we'd find influencers even in our competitors. It didn't really matter because we wanted to embrace everybody, and we wanted people to see that we were here about the community. It wasn't necessarily, we were competitors with K2 and Nintex, and I would walk up to those guys in the booth and say, hey, we have this whole idea of leveraging SharePoint better, so do you. Do you guys want to talk about how we can go to market and, how do you use SharePoint for business, not just technology? So it's really about finding those things, that common purpose that you could, work with the community and, evangelize, essentially.
So we've got now 50 names. And you don't have to do such a broad study. You could bring it down to 10 or 15 that you want to do. And so once you get those names, what we have to do is develop a plan. And that's what we're doing at Sonatype now, is that we're at the very, very beginning stages, where Debbie called me a couple months ago and said, we need to do the process. Do we need to do the process? I knew her name this time, so I picked up the phone on the first ring. So we need to go through the process again. So did the analysis. Who are the top influencers when it comes to open source security? Now what are we going to do? We're starting to get an engagement plan in place. First, you have to acknowledge them. Congratulations. Give them something to deal with. Hey, you're one of the top in the world, and that's the way we actually approach them. You are. We've done a study. You're one of the top in the world now. That's a nice stroke, right? So now you've got an emotional attachment because you just given them a compliment, and you start going through the process of engaging to build the relationship with the influencers. At some point in that process, you're going to find out how their passions align with your message. And right now, what's the message we have for Sonatype? What's our story at Sonatype?
Well, it's really the choice between speed, getting your business, your applications out to the world versus making them secure.
Right, so we're not talking about open source at all per se. That's off the table, like SharePoint's off the table. What we're talking about is there's a high level of risk when you're using open source components if they haven't been validated and verified. So you have risk versus security, and we're finding that most people are willing to take the risk, but we think it's because they don't know how big that risk is.
It's really risk versus speed.
Yeah, the developers are going to say, I need something to do this. Oh, it's in the repository. They're going to drag it down and put it in their app. 80% of applications, this is the way we've seen in the research, that 80% of most applications are built with open source components.
80% of every application, really, especially Java-based applications, are components versus source code, really.
Nobody's writing code anymore. They're just finding the components and then they're building like that. So our story is, absolutely, that's fast. It's a good way to do it, but there's an inherent risk in doing it that way. So we found our storyline. So then we have an incremental rollout. What we need to do is, it's great to reach the influencers, but there has to be touch points along the way. So when you're building your story and you're building your idea, what I would suggest is that you look at minimum of 6 months. How are you going to engage at least once a month for the next 6 months so you can build that relationship with the people? A lot of it has to do with following them on social media and actually finding what they're saying. Engage them in a conversation through the social media channels, through their blog. Everybody's got a blog.
But at the most basic level, it'd be great, maybe as you're thinking about rolling out, SharePoint in a new way, to get the faces of it. I mean, that's at the end of the day. How do you get, we talk a lot about this for this presentation, how do you get the faces of people who have done great things with your technology? You know, put the faces out there. You know, how do you get people who have done even the littlest things with, you know, in a way that you want SharePoint to be used in your company? And that's what we tried to do here is, you know, these are faces of people who have done great things, and Mark created a 50 and 50 interview set and interviewed them around, you know, what, if the topic is how can you use SharePoint to improve your business results instead of just as a file thing, which is what we're trying to do here, then all these people can talk about that. They have their own view of how they do it, but it shows 50 people who want to do something similar to that.
That's critical for your in-house communities. You have to look and find the people that are already engaged in what you're trying to do and then expose them. Give them credit for it. Hide behind the curtain and give them credit for it. And that's what starts the flow going there. So the outcome is that we did get global visibility, and through the measurements there was an exponential increase, not just in hits to the site but across the board. By actually engaging the influencer, we in a matter of months had global visibility. Now think about that, what that means. It was, when we first started the campaigns, nobody even knew the name Global 360. Within a matter of months, you could say the name Global 360 and people would say, okay, I recognize that name because I've heard it a lot now. They wouldn't know what we did yet. That's the next part of the campaign. You have to engage the influencers so that they start talking about the stories behind what you're trying to sell or service. We're not there yet at Sonatype, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've talked a little bit about this already.
Okay,
We're
good. So you've got a story, you've got an audience. That's the first two steps. Get your story, get your audience going. Now what do you do? Well, what we have to do is find the big dog in the game. Who's the big dog in the SharePoint game? Yeah, Microsoft. For me, this is a fascinating part of the story because I hardly had anything to do with it.
That was me.
This was Debbie down here. This is Microsoft.
The little dog.
Now, there was the external community and there was Microsoft. There were two separate campaigns going on with that. Debbie, I think this is fascinating. If you want to give a little talk about how you got engaged with Microsoft, it's
Yeah, and I think
fascinating.
we're going to talk about it a little bit on the slides
Okay.
as well. But yeah, so I think there's really two aspects of the campaigns. One, as they always say, all politics are local, right? So the idea is that we have to do two things in tandem. One is, let me step back. So in our case, Microsoft was the big dog because we need to align with the king in our court. We were a small software company. We needed the influence of someone like Microsoft. We needed them to be behind us as well as the SharePoint community. It doesn't have to be that way. Sonatype, just to give you an example, there's a group called OWASP. I don't know if you've ever heard of OWASP, but OWASP is an organization that's really well known if you're interested in security, especially around web applications. They create something called the top 10. It's the top 10 vulnerabilities that you have to be on the lookout for, the most concerning if you're building web applications, especially out of open source components. And so the idea that Mark and I had is, where does the community go now to find out information? And they go to this OWASP site. If we created our own site, people wouldn't necessarily go there because who's Sonatype, right? If we created our own site at Global 360, people wouldn't necessarily go there. We had to leverage off of that big dog in the community, which was the end user SharePoint site. Because where would people go if they want to find out about how businesses use SharePoint? Probably end user SharePoint. A lot of people go there just to hear that. So where do you go that already has traction in the marketplace you can attach to? There's the human side of it, which we talked about with influencers. Then there's the digital side of it, which we just talked about with that. And then there's the actual building the relationships. So community by community, it takes a lot of legwork. So we went city by city and worked with people within the Microsoft offices whose motivations were aligned with us. So who are those people? The people who want to sell SharePoint, the people who want to evangelize SharePoint within Microsoft. And say, guess what? You can go every day. You know how to sell the technology. well, what if we could share with you a way that you can sell SharePoint to the business owners? And they got very excited about that. And I literally was on a road tour with our organization, for a year and a half, just going city by city and building those types of relationships. What can we do for you? How can we come in to customers that you have and share that story? And then we went.
That's really important, if we can slow down just for a second. As you've got your story, when you're going into Microsoft, or when you're going into your big dog, whoever that is, it's not with the intention of, we want to sell to Microsoft. We don't want to sell to them. What we want to do is say, how can we help you sell your product? And that's what the approach was, because Microsoft didn't have a business process management solution for SharePoint. And so to say, we've got a solution that can help SharePoint with business users, it was an easy, relatively easy.
I don't know if these
case.
are, good ideas, but if you have a user group, right? How can we come together? You have a new technology, right, that you want to. How can other people with new technologies, how can you work with them to band together and say, hey, let's do a showcase for new technologies around SharePoint or whatever, right? So it's not just you alone, or have lunch and learns about having, your influencers show the projects they've done, right? And you probably thought of a lot of these things, but it's really just about getting people who are passionate about the same things to talk to people. And, you are the man behind the curtain. That's really what it is. It's not about trying to go out there and in the marketing or sales sense, getting the names and getting this and taking advantage of those people that are doing things. It's really about showcasing their success.
I really learned something from Jeff DeVerter. Do you guys know Rackspace? Have you heard of Rackspace? Jeff runs the SharePoint.
Happy rockers.
Jeff runs the SharePoint implementation for Rackspace. And even on the first time I met Jeff, one of the things he stuck out his hand and we said hello, and he said, so what can I do for you? How can I help you do what you do? I thought that was pretty phenomenal. If we can keep that in mind as we're talking to people to build this, how can I help you? It's going to be really what you're looking for to get that community going.
And the second half of that, if you go back just one
Okay.
slide, just to finish that. So you have to build those local relationships, but we also went and worked very, very, closely, very hard with the Microsoft, SharePoint, and Visio and other teams in Redmond. And so, we said, look, tell us where you're going with SharePoint. What are the challenges that you want to overcome? And again, that's how we found out about the licensing challenges. There were so many licenses that were out there, but not necessarily being used. And they were afraid that as renewals come, people would say, you know what, this is stuff that's sitting on the shelf. So their motivation was to get SharePoint off the shelf. We said, here's a whole new way of doing it. And we actually had Eric Swift, if you remember Eric Swift when he was the GM of the team, saying, you know what, these guys, K2 and our competitors, they're all technology, but you guys have a business. We actually had we should probably have shown him a screenshot, but we actually had, a beautiful user interface that was a SharePoint plugin, essentially, that allowed people to, do interface with managing invoices better, onboarding, any kind of process, processing insurance claims. So all of a sudden it made SharePoint look beautiful, and they go, wow, that's different. So again, we had aligned interests, but we treated them like a major client, like you would treat your best clients.
Right.
So it was that two-pronged, global and local efforts.
So now that you've found out, you've got your story, you've got your influencers, you're driving the engagement here. Now what we have to do is we have to really drive the awareness and the activity around the story. And I keep going back to the story. Not around the technology, but around your story. So I'm going to blast through these slides pretty quick because it's going to make sense, I think, when you see it. The first thing we have to do is we have to engage on external sites, other people's sites besides our own. If we're going to actually build a community model, we have to participate in what other people are doing. It's not just us. Good. Debbie, digital destinations?
Yeah, that's really what we were saying before, which was, find where people are already going to get information around, in our case, around SharePoint.
Good. And then we've got videos. We can drive awareness through videos. And it sounds like a no-brainer, and everybody talks about it, but very few people do it. And one of the things that happened here is Derek was able to set up a whole channel of videos on YouTube, and they don't have to be big. They don't have to be big at all. They really 2 to 3 minutes per video is really optimum, because think about what you do. You go in and you take a hit in the first 30 seconds. Does this interest me at all? Right? And by minute 3, I don't care how good it is, you're going to bail out. There's too much to do. So if you can keep these to 2 or 3 minutes, it's great. And so what I want to do is just quickly play one of these things so that you can see the storyline that we're building. I won't play all of it, but you can see a little bit about what we were working on here.
Profiles in Productivity by Global 360, a leader in business process management software. Meet Ivan and Erwin. They're a couple of aspiring young invoices, each with the same goal, to get paid on time. Ivan is a $30,000 invoice for software implementation services. He offers a 10% discount for payment within 10 days, but a 5% penalty if he isn't paid within 30.
Do you recognize the story?
Ivan's about to be delivered to Manual Enterprises. Erwin is a $32,000 invoice for IT consulting services. Like Ivan, Erwin also comes with a 10% discount for payment within 10 days and a 5% late fee after 30. Erwin is about to be delivered to Productive Inc. Even though Ivan and Erwin are very similar, they're about to embark on 2 very different journeys.
So the story there isn't about BPM. Nothing was said about BPM at all. It was building the emotional story. We all process invoices. And it was one of the markets we were going after. So that was, this thing had a couple of thousand views on it, I think. People were actually coming in to watch it. So we actually put the story into a video, and then, like I said, Derek had built a channel around that, so we could have a whole list of things like that. Debbie and Jen worked really hard on the trade show stuff. You want to talk about that and the integration there?
Yeah, I mean, again, making this not about necessarily Global 360, I think there's 2 major points.
Right.
Okay, point number 1 is, we could have talked about BPM all day, but the idea is you want to hear the sad, true story of Ira the invoice, who you see over time in the video. He starts growing a beard, and he's lying in the inbox, and he's never getting taken care of. Why? Because they have this manual process, and the guy goes on vacation and does this stuff, and the 5% penalty kicks in, and he's getting more and more expensive, where Irvin is having this great experience. And the idea is to make it more personal. And so everything we did, we tried to make it more personal, right? And we carried it through. So we had this kind of moniker. And every time someone saw, whether you're in financial services, but the idea is these guys became the heroes. You want to become a productivity hero? You can too. Now, how many SharePoint conferences have you gone to that you see people talking about you becoming a hero, or are they talking about their technology? It's always about the technology. So we stood out because nobody, we took people's pictures, and that was their pictures, and they filled out a card for us and said, this is my biggest challenges in productivity. I want to become a productivity hero like these guys. Why did all those people do that? Well, because if they got their little star by the name, we'd give them $100. But think of how valuable it is for me to go back to my company and say, here's a picture of someone who wants to improve a process, a human, and they're writing to you what they want to improve, right? What do you want to do better in your business? Then you figure out how SharePoint fits in. And that's what we tried to do here, is everywhere we went, we tried to build little communities. And at this conference, within the local conference, we built this little community of people that all wanted the same things. But the point is that Mary and Bob and everybody else made it personal. And that's the idea of what what it's all about.
This, for me, was hilarious. Debbie, you and I have never talked about this, but we literally, this is at one of the trade shows, and we took this board back to Dallas to show the salespeople, and they started fighting over which one of these, who they would get. It was fascinating how it worked. So this is actually making them a hero. One of the most popular workshops I've ever produced, and it sold out every time. Paul Grenier and I put it on. It was called How to Become a SharePoint Superstar. And that thing sold out every time because everybody wants to be a superstar. And in this case, we were able to make them that. Then we had webcasts. This is going by the board because there's so many webcasts now. I'm sure in your inbox you've got 5 webcasts that are happening today. I know I do. People send them all the time. So this might be overdone unless you've got a real message that you want to send. I know that, who was it? I did a webcast for Harmony. They're downstairs here, but they're out of Israel. And they asked me to put on a webcast last month, and we had 300 people show up on the webcast. I thought that was a nice turnout. But then it was an idea that people are around now. It's mobile. How do you get SharePoint and mobile together? So you got to think about that. This is a big one now. We're not talking about white papers. White papers are a dime a dozen. But if you can rename it ebook, you've got something you can hand out, right? So this was big, the ebooks and things like that. It was useful in other ways because an ebook has legs, because you can break out parts of it, you can segment it, things like that. So this is a pretty powerful one if you can make it. It's internal communities too. If you can say something, if you can put together, say, 5 case studies internally of what people have done with what you're trying to do, that's a nice handout.
It's really giving one at a time. It's breaking the content up into very small chunks, and that's what the idea is here.
Yeah. So, and then this is a big one, and we can follow up with what we're doing in the second with Sonatype. This is what we did at Global 360. Derek Weeks actually had a survey. And so whatever the survey is, it doesn't matter. You put your survey together and put the questions together. But the idea that we got was this was important to the community, and Derek immediately started getting speaking engagements just by showing this up. Sadie Van Buren did it with the SharePoint maturity model. How many people know about the maturity model? If you haven't seen that, you might want to look at it. The SharePoint maturity model by Sadie Van Buren. Sadie did it. If you can get people to participate in a survey, you've got a gold mine worth of data there.
Well, we should bring this all together by saying the story is the story. The story in our case in Sonatype, speed versus security. The story here is better user experience, bringing business and SharePoint together. And all of these things are just different ways of telling the story. One is with data, one's with people's successes, one's with, who's the biggest influencers in this market, what is their story, and it's all about providing these little bits of content 360 degrees, because this is what, what's the user experience? So we went and took this to the people at Microsoft and said, here's some data about your own product that you might not know. So it's all about really just evangelizing, using that word, but in a way that's hopefully meaningful to people, to get people engaged around your story. And then you're looked at as a leader and someone, oh, and by the way, we have this great technology, you want to download some. And that's really what it's about. If you go to the next slide, you added that, sorry.
There you go.
I was going to say, so we're doing that also at Sonatype. We asked, 3,500 people responded to the survey and said, how do you feel that 80% of your application, in general, are components? And they said, 64% thinks that right, 86%, but 22% thought that it was low. So basically, they're saying the vast majority of all applications in our organizations are components. Well, components are great. They make things go fast. But there's copyleft and GPL licenses and all kinds of IP risks, but there's also security risks. So, this was great for us to do education. And you can take every little infographic like this, and there's a week. Every
That's
week,
right.
you want
Every week.
some new
Dripping it
information
out.
about your applications you didn't know, just hand it out each week and build people around the community by giving them something.
Back to Debbie's point a little while ago, everything we did had headshots, right? People recognize themselves. They're gonna send people here for you. But this, we went and took the survey and just put it in people's hands that we knew. Susan Lennon, who works at SharePoint for the Navy. Rob Bogue, who is the SharePoint Shepherd's Guide, if you know him, Richard Harbridge. These are people that are very well known in the community. We'd surprise them and say, here's a graph from the survey, what's your response to it? And we recorded it. So again, even internally, if we can get the faces up there so that people recognize them, it's going to be a nice add to it. This is point 5, so we can round this up. But it's a campaign I had never seen before until Debbie and I started working together. It's called Make Everyone a Marketer. And the idea is that there is so much going on in your business where there are touch points out in the world that aren't being utilized. Simple things like everyone is a marketer, meaning is there anything we could put on our accounting? Is there anything that we could put on the maintenance bill? Anything that goes out physically or through email? Is there something that we can put on there that can act as a little marketing message?
And marketing message meaning that, if you go back for just 1 second, you know, marketing message meaning that if you have some great success in your SharePoint sites or, you know, anything interesting, not, hey, have you checked out my product lately, but have you seen this great survey or whatever, right? Why wouldn't it go out? Our invoices said something about, have you heard about Ira the Invoice? And even on our own invoices, you wouldn't think about that, but then drives people to the video, so at least they have some exposure. And who better to market to than someone else's accounting department, right?
But this was an interesting because you see where it says, have you heard the true story of Ira the Invoice? George, the CFO, used to put this one on the bottom of his email signatures, the CFO. And he said he was getting people calling him on the phone saying, this is cool, this is really cool. So if you've got the story, let's include it wherever we can. This was an interesting one. It didn't relate to our story. But when we sent a bill out to somebody, one of our guys actually in handwriting said that we were building a hospital. Hey, thanks for saving a life today. And he got a response back from the hospital on that one. Just different touch points that make it a personal. He built a relationship because of that. So in summary here, we've got a 5-step process. Create your story. Find what your real story is. Then find out who within your company, if you're doing an internal community or external, who the influencers are. Find the big person that you need to align with and see how you can help them. Then drive the activity around your story and then make everybody on your team part of the marketing campaign. And that part of it was fun. People were having fun with that. All right, so it's your turn. You need to take this out. The deck's going to be online when it goes, so you can take this as a reminder for the 5 steps. But I hope that gave you something to think about so that you can start saying, okay, start with the story. Where's my story here? Okay?